Hello, my name is Sean Cunningham of Wrestling Audio Revolution, and welcome to the History of Wrestling. On this episode, I'd like to talk about the history of Texas wrestling and the absolute explosion of that regional territory at the end of 1982. Now, for some of our younger listeners who may not know, the NWA title was defended not on a national platform like Nitro or Raw or anything WB like pay-per-view. In that time, there was nothing like pay-per-view, so every regional promotion would have big shows, usually around holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, as well as holidays in summertime, July 4th, and times like that. In Texas, there were the Von Erichs, who basically dominated world-class championship wrestling, who was promoted by their father, Fritz Von Erich, who was a former very talented wrestler himself. In 1982, that regional territory became very, very popular and even got worldwide syndicated television at the time, the obligatory 1 hour on Saturdays or Sundays, or even in the middle of the night in some cases. What happened in 1982? In the fall of 1982, Kerry Von Erich, probably the best-looking wrestler in terms of all five sons of Fritz, was being groomed to be their contender for the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, who was Ric Flair, who would tour around the country and be in a territory for 2 or 3 weeks, or even a month, to build to a big show in a certain territory, and wrestle that one big match, and then move on to the next territory. He was the only wrestler, really, as far as the NWA territories, that would kind of be a touring attraction. He wouldn't stay in one territory for 3 or 4 months like all the other talent would. He was being groomed, however, to have a long run as champion. But they were looking to the future for somebody younger, and that choice originally might have been Kerry. Now, the storyline they did with Ric Flair leading up to the Christmas Star Wars shows was that in a match in Kansas City, which was a completely different territory, that the Great Kabuki, managed by Gary Hart, who also spent a great deal of time in Texas, has injured Kerry due to a bounty paid by Ric Flair. And there was television talk for weeks and weeks and weeks about how Ric Flair had paid a bounty to Gary Hart to injure Kerry, because Ric clearly didn't want to face him and was afraid to face him. And there was all kinds of talk, and then eventually you had Ric Flair come on to do one of these studio sports show type interviews with split screens with Fritz Von Erich, who basically came out and accused Flair of paying the bounty to Gary Hart to injure Kerry. Flair never once, in perfect heel fashion, admitted to paying the bounty. Said everything but. Fritz was screaming and yelling and wanting to come through the studio and choke Ric Flair by the end of the interview. One of the greatest moments of wrestling television that you'd ever seen, because this built to a match that, as the NWA did their quote-unquote investigation, they had decided that Flair had ordered the bounty, and he was going to be placed in a steel cage match on Christmas night with Kerry Von Erich. Now, the people of the NWA, as well as the promoters in Texas, decided that this steel cage match would have 2 referees. One would be a typical wrestling referee. In the case of Texas, there were 2 major ones: Bronco Lubitsch, who was a former NFL football player, and David Manning. Also, the second referee would be a fan vote, and they mentioned a couple of wrestlers, the most notable being Michael Hayes of the Fabulous Freebird faction. Now, as a side note, this is how in a territory you would use the NWA World title if you weren't going to have the champion in your territory for very long, or you weren't going to have your star of the territory win the title. You use the title to build your big storyline, even if it wasn't going to be there. This was one of the things that the Texas territory did very well at this point. What had happened is earlier in October, the Fabulous Freebirds, notably from Georgia, came into the territory as friends of Carrie's younger brother David. All three of the group, Terry Gordy, Buddy Roberts, and Michael Hayes, who had been there longest, who I believe arrived first in October of 1982, all sold to the fans as friends of David's. World Class Championship Wrestling also used this to launch the 6-man world title. The 6-man tag team matches. So 3 men versus 3 men would have a series of tag matches and have a tournament, become champion. That tournament ended on Christmas night, with the Freebirds, with Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy being at the show in Texas, and their partner, Buddy Jack Roberts, quote-unquote, being snowed in Colorado and not being able to make the show. The Freebirds offered to win the tournament 2-on-3, but just then David Von Erich came from the back and stepped in to that match on Christmas night to help the Freebirds win the 6-man tag team title, and then said in an interview that he would surrender his third of the title to give to Buddy Roberts once he arrived in Texas. This comes back later on in the night because Michael Hayes was voted as the special referee for the Kerry Von Erich, Ric Flair, NWA World title match in a steel cage. So as that match started, Michael Hayes came out to referee and brought Terry Gordy with him and said that Terry Gordy would be the special gatekeeper for the door so no one could get in or out of the cage. And as the match started, you noticed that Michael Hayes was very, very angry and aggressive, probably the most aggressive refereeing I think I've ever seen. Pulling on Ric Flair's hair, wanting to disqualify people immediately, physically pulling wrestlers off each other, all of those type of things. And as the match went on, there was a series of collisions and people bumping into each other, and the way it goes down is Kerry bumped into Flair, who bumped into Michael Hayes. Michael Hayes turns around and knocks Ric Flair out and tells Kerry to pin him. Kerry refuses. Flair gets up, knocks Kerry inadvertently into Michael Hayes. Michael Hayes gets up angrily and all he sees when he gets up is a steel chair and Kerry Von Erich standing there. So the angry Michael Hayes gets up, leaves the cage with Terry Gordy, just as Kerry Von Erich is about to get up and try and talk sense to Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy, what's going on. Kerry got a little too close to the door, and Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy slammed the door on his head. Ric Flair, being the opportunist that he was, took the opportunity to pin Kerry, but there was no referee to count it, as the other referee had also been knocked down, so the match essentially had been thrown out. But what came of this was the long-running feud between the Fabulous Freebirds and the Von Erich family, the 3 main brothers, Kerry, Kevin, and David, that went on for years to make the Texas territory one of the hottest things in regional wrestling and almost in the world, as a predecessor to what WWE became in this national grandiose thing. Like I had said earlier, Texas was able to get syndicated television not only throughout the country, but in other parts of the world. I know the Middle East was mentioned. A lot of the Arab countries decided to pick up World Class Championship Wrestling. Israel, Saudi Arabia, things like that. But it made the territory so hot that it was must-see television. And it was one of the things that literally became a catalyst for what Vince McMahon and WWE used almost as their national platform to take stars and build the crazy empire that we see now. But if it wasn't for storylines like in World Class Championship Wrestling with the Von Erichs and the Freebirds, the regional rivalry that exists in the South between Georgia and Texas, we wouldn't have wrestling as it is today. My name is Sean Cunningham, and that is another part of the history of wrestling.